Russia's involvement there, as well as the migrant issue and how Europe is or is not addressing that. And in between a lunch with Sebastian Gorka, we'll be talking about all of these issues and how they relate to Islam and democracy overall. So it should be a very enjoyable next several hours. And introducing our speakers for this panel is our very brilliant managing editor of Providence, Mark Levecki. So Mark.
He was saying managing editor. I thought he was going to say brilliant and manly. I was very excited. I'll let you decide if that's true.
Prove it to be the case.
That's right. All right, as you all probably know, in December of last year, Secretary of Defense Ash Carter announced the decision to open all combat jobs in the United States military to women. This ended the policy of not assigning women to direct combat units directly, such as artillery, armor, infantry, and special operations teams. Now, many arguments have been made against the decision, and many for. The arguments against have been featured in the online pages of Providence and elsewhere by Providence editors and writers. These arguments deal with the typical issues of durability over sustained combat, infantry training or deployment, rates of injury and non-deployability, attrition, sexual and relational dynamics, fraternization, hygiene issues, and much else that draws attention to the substantial and substantive ways in which men and women, contrary to popular fashion of the day, and not entirely abrogated by merit or grit, are simply not entirely interchangeable. But Providence arguments have also included the understanding that the differences between men and women include other dimensions. At Providence, we're wont to gesture to the Christian tradition. In doing so, as I do here to Thomas Aquinas, we see, for example, Thomas Aquinas recognized that there's certainly different sexual plumbing and different muscular and skeletal capacities between men and women, but he believed that these differences signaled differences also in purpose, in function, and in aptitude. These differences for Thomas went all the way down to the level of the soul. The human soul for Thomas is sexed. It is itself gendered. And like the physical distinctions, these differences in the soul are purposive. Function follows form. One might think here of the San Bernardino terrorist attacks. Recall that Shannon Johnson threw his body over his co-worker, Denise Peraza. He took the bullets that were intended for her. And there was no real logical reason that he should have done this, no real logical reason that he ought to have died for her. He had no direct responsibility for her, but he did do this. And I think, at least in some of the circles I run, we rather expected this kind of behavior from someone like him. At least when he did it, we were moved to honor him for it. I think that suggests to me. I strongly suspect, moreover, that had she thrown her body over him and taken the bullets intended for him, our reaction would have been both the same in some ways, but also different. We would have rightly, I trust, honored her incredible courage and her self-sacrifice. Nevertheless, I think we might also have recognized or suspected that something is amiss, something's different, something is as it ought not to be, perhaps. I recognize these differences ought to do no harm, to also recognizing the truth of the equal worth and the equal dignity and essential personhood of men and women. Simply, it is to argue that equal doesn't necessarily mean the same. Now, if this fact of the non-fungibility of man and woman is accurate, it's not the only accurate fact in play. It's also a fact that war has changed, that front lines are no longer hard, they're fluid. Women get pulled into ground combat whether they are directly assigned to it or not. Moreover, there are various specialties in which women play essential roles. Human intelligence gatherers, military police, etc. Especially in Muslim countries, there are crucial forward frontline roles that women, in particular, can play especially well, better than men in many cases. These roles, obviously, often put women in highly kinetic situations. So then any conversation regarding women in combat must, it seems to me, include other facts. One fact, in their role within the global war against terror, more than 160 women have been killed and over 1,000 wounded in action. Also, 9,000 women have earned the Combat Action Badge. Hundreds have earned Valor Awards, including the Silver Star, which is the nation's third highest award for valor. These facts have to be remembered. For these reasons and many others, some will argue that it is time to officially recognize what has long been the case, to officially recognize what women have long been doing. Thus, Secretary Carter opened direct combat to women, pledging not to lower standards, and he has chosen to allow merit to win the right for women to enter those direct combat roles previously open only to men. So following that decision, we are now also on the cusp of a national debate as to whether to open conscription to women. A prospect that, whatever the practical remoteness of a draft, it will have a lot to say about our nation's principles, our nation's values. Now, in some ways, this is professionally interesting to me, right? But it is also personally interesting to me. I am the son of a mother. I am the brother of a sister, husband of a wife. And here, crucially, I'm the father of a daughter, right? And so each of these women share in different ways. Each of these women attest in different ways to what a powerful, capable, awe-inspiring woman can be. Or in the case of my little one, she demonstrates what a young girl on her way, God willing, to being a powerful, capable, awe-inspiring woman looks like, all right? So I have skin in this. I desire to see my little one flourish. And so, to the question of the role of women in combat, I have a professional and deeply intimate interest. So I've invited a few folks to help me sort all this out, which is one of the benefits of doing what I do. So first up, Chaplain Meeker is the Lieutenant Colonel in the United States Army. She is a graduate of Bucknell University and Harvard Divinity School. Chaplain Meeker enlisted in the Army in 1986, graduating basic as the Soldier of the Cycle, which is an award identifying her as the top soldier in her basic training company. 4 years later, she received an ROTC commission. Chaplain Meeker has been on a fellowship at IWP since returning last summer from Jordan. She has served with the 1st Armored Division, the 101st Airborne Division, Air Assault, in Afghanistan, 2nd Infantry Division in Korea, and the 82nd Airborne Division. Chaplain Meeker was the first female chaplain to serve in the U.S. Army Special Operations Command. She was the first female chaplain to serve as the executive officer for the Army Chief of Chaplains. She was the first female chaplain to complete Jump Master and Pathfinder schools. And she is the first female chaplain to serve on a panel for Providence, okay, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy. It's probably the least notable, but we recognize good company when we see it, and we want to glow them up. So, additionally, Chaplain Meeker was the Officer Honor Graduate at Basic Airborne School, and her many other awards and badges include the Legion of Merit, the Master Parachutist Badge. In 2004, Chaplain Meeker received the Distinguished Service Award from the Military Chaplains Association. It's just wonderful to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Jumping over, Dr. Mackubin Thomas Owens is Dean of Academics at the Institute of World Politics. You're beginning to know the theme here. He's the editor of Orbis, the quarterly journal of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, Philadelphia. He served in the Marine Corps and Marine Corps Reserve for 30 years, including a tour as an infantry officer in Vietnam, 1968 to 1969. He retired as a professor of national security affairs at the Naval War College in September of 2014 after teaching there for 28 years. He writes widely on national security issues, including U.S. civil-military relations. And finally, as Vice President of the Heritage Foundation, Jennifer A. Marshall runs the think tank's Institute for Family, Community, and Opportunity. In that capacity, she oversees research into a variety of issues that determine the strength and character of American society and its capacity to lead on the world stage. Issues explored by the Institute researchers range from marriage, life issues, religious liberty to health, education, and welfare to the application of America's founding principles in today's various challenges. Marshall is a graduate of Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. She has a master's degree in statecraft and world politics from the Institute of World Politics, and a Master of Arts in Religion from Reformed Theological Seminary, where she is also a senior research fellow and teaches in the seminary's Institute of Theology and Public Life. So with all of that, please welcome Chaplain Mier.
Thanks so so much for that warm welcome, and thank you for this opportunity to be a part of this panel today. It's such an honor to share the platform and table with such distinguished people, and I just want to thank the Dean for his decorated service in uniform with the Marines and his distinguished continued service as a scholar and academician. Thank you, sir. And Jennifer, your work and heritage, thank you for that, and what you do helps us in the Army, in the chaplaincy. And I look forward to talking to you about some other issues that we just started a conversation right before the panel. So thank you. And it's a great blessing to be here as a fellow at the Institute of World Politics, and I'd just like to take a moment just to say thank you to the Institute for this opportunity to be here this year, and to thank the nation for a year to study. We're like, unlike any other country in the world where officers get trained at every rank, and so it's a great privilege, and I know I've gained personally and professionally from this year, and this is just another great opportunity to grow and to learn. So looking forward to the discussion on today's topic, Women in Combat, which is also near and dear to me as well. It's both professional and personal. So yesterday started Women's History Month, and so I recognize that I stand on the shoulders of many outstanding women who have gone before and who currently serve. We have people such as Jennifer Matthews, CIA operator, who was killed in action in Afghanistan in Khost in 2009, who served for many years with the CIA, expert in her field. As was mentioned, we have Silver Star, also in Afghanistan, Army medic Monica Lynn Brown, who was serving with the 82nd Airborne Division in Salerno when they were ambushed, and she ran through direct gunfire and to render aid to the wounded. She shielded the wounded from mortar fire and received the Silver Star for her glorious action. There are attack pilots such as Captain Kimberly Hampton, Kiowa pilot, who was killed in Iraq in 2004. She was also serving with the 82nd Airborne Division with 117 Cab when she was shot down and killed. We have contractors serving in combat. Megan McClung was one. She served as a contractor in combat, and then she returned as a major in the United States Marine Corps as a public affairs officer when she was killed in action in the Anbar province in 2006. And so we have women in combat, women who are journalists, contractors, doctors, teachers, missionaries, military personnel, attack pilots, MPs, medics, logisticians. They've been serving in combat, and they continue to serve in combat even today, right now. And so I mention those individuals as vignettes of the many women who are serving, to say that what was, when I came in the military in the late 80s, was a very linear battlefield. It was Cold War era, and there was front line, and you had your infantry and your armor, and from there to your log trains. And so it was very, very distinct, 2 up, 1 back, full the gap, Cold War, big big fight, large formations, where that is not the case today. The battlefield is 360 degrees. It's all around. And I think we got our first awareness of that during the Iraq invasion, when a low-precision unit was attacked, when it got lost and was off course in Iraq in 2003, and Jessica Lynch, a 92 Yankee a supply specialist, got caught up in that and was captured by the enemy. That was, I think, the first time we really got a feel for, this is a different kind of war now, and it really is 360 degrees. It's up, it's across, it's behind, it's all around. And so when Jessica Lynch testified before Congress and said that she hadn't fired her weapon, I think that was a wake-up call for all the military, that every soldier needs to be prepared for combat, because that's how we fight today. And we have to fight the war that we're in, not the war that we want. And so 360-degree battle, and that all our service members, all those who find themselves on the battlefield, are in combat, and we need to prepare our forces for that. And so as the military has gone forward, and there's talk of the force of the future, that force of the future is matching a person's capabilities and their skills with particular military occupation specialties. And so there's a lot of reform going on, I know, in the Army and the personnel, but across Department of Defense, to match skills with positions. And as those positions have opened, and the military had 3 years to give an assessment back to the Department of Defense on whether any positions should be closed, some of the results of that have been that they've looked at particular jobs, and all specialties, and what is required. There's certainly different requirements for different jobs in the military, from the field artillery, where the field artilleryman must carry and must be able to load 100-pound shells, from a cyber warrior who needs the intellect to work on computer and technology and things like that. And so very different requirements. And so I know within the Army it's been very good for us to look at those requirements and to match the training, to match the standards with those jobs. And so that's been very helpful and very good reform, and I think we'll see a better force because of that. And so the Secretary of Defense has given 7 guidelines to help with the implementations. There is concern, both men and women, on that the force would maintain its effectiveness, and not only maintain but improve its effectiveness on the battlefield. And so the Secretary of Defense has given 7 guidelines for this implementation, and I'd like to just briefly go through those 7 guidelines. One is to have the clear objective at all times to improve force effectiveness. And second, that each of these positions should be based on ability of the whole person, not just physical capabilities and intellectual, but also moral character as well. So taking the whole person into account. Third, that there should be no quotas. That equal opportunity does not necessarily mean equal participation. And so that's important for keeping the effectiveness of the force and managing expectations. Number 4, again, I think this deals with managing expectations, that it's okay to have small numbers, that there won't be large numbers in the foreseeable future in traditionally male-only combat roles. 5, concern regarding lower standards to decrease effectiveness. Both men and women have expressed that no one wants to see lower standards. We want to see standards that meet the requirements of the job, of the position, and maintain those. 6, the recognize the importance of the small teams. So while this shift, this opening of these positions may look like the military is focused on the individual performance, we don't want to take our eye off of the importance of the performance of a small team. How does gender integration affect the effectiveness of the small team? It's those small teams on which other teams are built, and the real strength of the overall team is that small building block of that small team. So making sure that performance maintains its readiness for combat. And 7th, not all our international partners share gender integration for all positions. So this is important for us as we work with our allies and our partners across the world, and how does that affect those relationships. So 7 guidelines that he has given to help guide the integration and the implementation of this new policy. And so as I look back, and I think, when I started out in the Army in the 90s, I think of some of my college friends who were extraordinarily talented young women. They came out of their high schools as valedictorians. They Phi Beta Kappa in college, captains of their athletic teams. These women, my college friends, just incredible people. And I've often thought, wow, it would have been neat to have just one of those women even consider the military. They didn't consider the military, and one of the reasons I think is because what they would consider the camping aspect of the military. But I think other issues perhaps were because they were super competitive, and because it wasn't a level playing field, that they couldn't compete at every turn. That would just not suffice. There were just too many doors closed that it would just not sit with them. I know during the 90s, Ranger School was closed to only those who were in combat branches, and I thought that at the time, what a shame. It's really unfortunate that that's the case, because Ranger School, it seems for the Army, it seemed to me at least, that's where the Army developed its leaders in the early stages of leadership to groom them for later, more senior leadership positions. And so in the 90s, when they closed it to combat arms only, it closed it essentially to women, and so that leadership school was then closed to any women serving in the Army. So I'm happy that that door has opened, because we need to train all our leaders at the best leadership schools and give women the opportunity, and I'm glad that opportunity has opened. I believe that we are, men and women are equal but different and different. And so I believe that we have been created in the image of God, male and female, and that there are differences. Thanks be to God that there are obvious differences. But then we're also different. Not everyone fits a prescribed role, and I think I demonstrate that in my own life. I'm non-traditional in two ways. I'm clergy, which is traditionally male, and I'm a soldier, which is also traditionally male. But as I read the scriptures, I see that God calls sometimes the most unlikely to serve in positions for His glory. And so I pray that I have been faithful to His call on my life to serve Him and the nation. And so I thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions and the discussion.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
The reason I ask is my head is stuffed up, and I'm stuffed up for a long time. I can hear myself fine. That's the problem, of course. All right, well, first of all, I stand in awe of the Chaplain Mier. I mean, anybody who chooses to jump out of a perfectly aired airplane is standing in my position, in my thought. Well, let me start out by saying that I'm categorically opposed to the idea of opening the infantry and special operations forces to women. Now, before you dismiss me as a grouchy, old, out-of-touch misogynist, let me say that I taught at the Naval War College for a long time, and that my female students up there, the women who came through, were quite spectacular. It was my impression that they were the match of any male in terms of strategic thinking and the like. But my own experience in the Marine Corps and my study of all aspects of war has convinced me that the idea of integrating women into the infantry is not a good idea. My argument has been based not only on physical differences, but also on psychological differences. These are very important, and there's sometimes a lot left. We always want to stress the idea of diversity, but the battlefield mocks diversity. It doesn't care about diversity. It doesn't care about equality. It cares about success. And the substantial evidence that seems to be clear that the integration of women into the infantry actually degrades that military effectiveness. Now let me address something I think that the chaplain mentioned. Women have been in combat for a long time. But there's a difference between being in combat and being in the infantry. If you're on a convoy that basically takes fire, you return fire, and you try to get out. If you're in the infantry, you come out of fire, you go after those guys. You close with and destroy the enemy. That, I think, is a substantial difference. Now, the chaplain also mentioned the idea of teams. The Marine Corps did a 9-month, $36 million study that indicated that all male units perform better than sexually integrated units. They were faster, they were stronger, more lethal in most cases than the ones that included women. And the women also suffered higher injury rates than the males. Now, of course, the study came under a substantial attack, most disgracefully by the Secretary of the Navy. I have to say it's a good thing I no longer teach at the Naval War College, because he is a political hat. I'm sorry. You quote me from that, of the worst sort. Here's what he basically did. He said that he was on an interview on NPR, that the study started out with a fairly large component of men thinking that this is not a good idea and women will not be able to do this, and that belief impacted the results. He also essentially disparaged the women who were involved in the study, suggesting the Marines didn't choose the best ones, and when in fact they did. And I have to say that I can't imagine any previous Secretary of the Navy disparaging and insulting gratuitously one of the services for which he is responsible. Now, let me list my 10 reasons, or not 10, but several reasons why I think the idea of integrating women in the military into the infantry is not a good thing. As the chaplain said, the front lines are everywhere. The old idea about what constitutes the battlefield has changed. Nonetheless, as I said before, being in the infantry where your purpose, your mission is to close with and destroy the enemy is different than being in the service support, combat service support units, where you may have to come under fire and return fire, but your job is essentially to protect yourself rather than to turn on and destroy the enemy. Men and women are different, not only physically, but also psychologically. And I think this is one of the most important things to consider. Women are going to suffer higher rates of injury. A wonderful article came out in 2012 in the Marine Corps Gazette, written by a Marine Corps captain, Katie Petrino, who was an engineer officer. And she started out by saying exactly, she is sort of the poster woman for the sort of person that would go into the infantry. She was a star athlete in college. She became a combat engineer, and over her period of time, through 2 deployments, she came to the conclusion that the infantry life was not for females, because of her own experience and the experience of other women in terms of the health issues. And this is something we have to take into account over a long period of time. As I said before, if the idea is to increase military effectiveness, this is not the way to go. I think that the Marine study seems to prove that. There's also the fact that despite the fact that the integration of women into these units does not necessarily increase military effectiveness, it does increase costs. You look at what changes have had to be made on Navy ships in terms of billeting and so forth. And these are not inconsequential. It's also the fact that most women don't want to be in the infantry. Okay, you don't have a long line of people beating on the door to become members of the infantry. And I have to say that in many cases, the idea of women in the infantry has been pushed by ideologues on the one hand and some careers within the military on the other. It opens, as Mark said, it opens the possibility of the draft. It will cause us to have to revisit Rosker versus Goldberg, the 1981 Supreme Court decision that exempted women from the draft because they were not eligible for combat. Although the draft is a distant prospect in most cases, this is something I think that the mothers and the husbands of America are not necessarily, and the fathers of America are not necessarily keen about doing. And there's also this last point. Sorry, my voice is going, so I'm going to hold on the best I can here. That English is a very rich language, but every now and then it comes up against distinctions. The Greeks had classical Greek has 2 words for love. One is philia, the other is eros. Philia refers to brotherly love, comradeship, the sort of thing, bonding that you see in military units. And it's basically the basis of unit cohesion, which is one of the most important determinants of military effectiveness. J. Glenn Gray wrote a book called The Warriors, Reflections of Men in Battle. And he wrote that numberless soldiers have died more or less willingly, not for country or honor or religious faith or for any other abstract good, but because they realized that by fleeing their post and rescuing themselves, they would expose their companions to greater danger. Such loyalty to the group is the essence of fighting morale. The commander can preserve and strengthen it knows that all other physical and psychological factors are of little consequence in comparison. The feeling of loyalty, it is clear, is a result, not the cause, of comradeship. Comrades are loyal to each other spontaneously and without any need for a reason. Now, this is the basis in military units of fairness. The idea basically that you treat individuals fairly, not because one is a man or a woman, because one is white or black or something like this. It has traditionally been the essence of cohesion. Now, the problem is, and we've seen this in many cases, if you take that sort of environment based on philia, and you loosen eros into that environment, that's going to cause all sorts of problems. Eros is individual as opposed to looking at the group. And what in many cases will lead to sexual competition, jealousy, all these sorts of things that will undermine this sort of cohesion, I think, that is very necessary in all of this. The final issue is standards. Now, I know there's been a promise not to change standards, but General Dempsey, when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man I admire greatly, basically opened the door when he said that the services will have to justify their standards. Well, that sounds all well and good. That's also an invitation to the political types, basically, to change those standards if they feel it's necessary. Now, I'd like to end by saying that it's interesting how many articles opposed to opening the infantry to women have been written by women themselves. I mentioned this article by Kate Petrino. There have been at least a dozen others, including the Wall Street Journal, by an Army officer, West Point graduate, and the like. But there are a number of women who've been in that situation and who realize that it's not tailor-made for women. Now, I would end by saying that if you want to get a sense of why women don't belong in the infantry, you should take time to read two books. The first is by my friend Bing West, called 1 Million Steps. Came out not too long ago, and he basically follows a Marine company in Afghanistan over their tour. And you see what this kind of today's combat is like. The other is by a friend and colleague of mine from Vietnam named Carl Marlantes. It's a novel called Matterhorn. It's not about bobsledding, it's about Vietnam. And I think it's the best, along with Jim Webb's book, Fields of Fire, is the best book about Vietnam that you're going to read. And as I suggested to Secretary Mavis, that perhaps he ought to have read these books before he made the decision that he did, which I think will eventually get lives lost. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, and it's an honor to be with my fellow panelists, and I thank them for their service to our country and the service that they rendered by thinking this issue through so deeply. It's wonderful to be back at the Institute of World Politics. I studied here about, 8 years ago, and have many good friends, and enjoy seeing the faculty when I'm able to be back. So thank you for the warm welcome here. I'm going to begin with my perspective that I'm bringing today is from a public policy perspective, but I think also informed by a Christian worldview as we seek how to work that out in public policy. And for the last half century, women in the United States have been breaking through so-called glass ceilings, those actual or assumed barriers to our participation in a variety of educational and vocational fields. As a result, almost every imaginable option is open to us today, and we can pursue those as our gifts and interests match those opportunities. But still, as we've been talking about, women have not reached every last possibility, and that should make us ask why. Well, when we encounter remaining distinctions between women and men in society today, we need to determine whether they are, in fact, glass ceilings that should be broken, like so many before, or if they are actually more like load-bearing walls, anchored in something fundamental about how we are designed as individuals and relate in community. Now, the image of a glass ceiling suggests a feature that can be removed without changing the basic building structure. It is incidental to the structural coherence, and in fact, its very arbitrariness may argue for its removal. Breaking a glass ceiling causes some cultural disruption, of course. Navigating that metaphoric broken glass can make us all more self-conscious and cautious for a while, but it soon gets swept away and largely forgotten. Tearing down a load-bearing wall, on the other hand, changes something fundamental about the inherent structure. It is a much more significant and costly proposition that cannot be undertaken in isolation. It will definitively change the character of the structure as a whole. A woman getting elected to the presidency of the United States would break a glass ceiling. Sending women into combat roles is tearing down a load-bearing wall. And it's one that I will argue should not be demolished based on 4 points: priority of military mission, realism about sex and gender, protecting life, and concerns about how it will shape society at large. So first, mission must be the standard in this debate. The military's mission is to fight and win the nation's wars, and accomplishing that combat mission must take priority over individual attainment. However much we may admire the drive and accomplishment of those women who seek to serve our nation in combat capacities, we need to determine from the outset whether to analyze this question from the perspective of individual attainment or from the perspective of the mission as a whole. Now, even to be able to frame the question in that way reveals our tremendous sense of security. That the military can contemplate setting professional development and social reform goals as categories distinct from the goals of combat effectiveness is a result of the extraordinary success of the U.S. Armed Forces in safeguarding the nation. Whether that margin can be maintained while pursuing objectives that many believe could detract from combat effectiveness remains to be seen. Now, of course, some will argue that the goals of mission effectiveness and women's participation in combat units are not mutually exclusive. Women most certainly can and do contribute mightily to the overall mission of the military, as we've heard today. The vast majority of them, however, do not seem to want to be a part of combat missions. And there's been reference to the February 2014 Army survey of 30,000 responses from women in active duty, reserves, and National Guard, which found that only 7.5% said that they wanted to take part in those combat specialties. The decision to integrate women in combat units also disregards the recommendation last September of the Commandant of the Marine Corps against including women in some combat roles. That conclusion was informed by the extensive survey that the Marine Corps did on mixed-gender units over a 9-month period, which evaluated the teams participating on 134 ground combat tasks. All male units in that evaluation outperformed those made up of men and women in 69% of the tasks. Mixed units outperformed male units in just 2. The findings also showed significant differentials between male and female performance. Top-performing females overlapped with low-performing males. Beyond making the initial cut, of course, women must maintain a very high level of performance over time to participate effectively in these combat units. Yet, in the Marine Combat Integration Test, female training course completion rates lagged well behind men. In an evaluation of Army basic combat training, women had an injury rate almost twice that of men. In addition to the significant risks this poses to the women themselves, it does not maximize combat effectiveness. Proponents of female integration into combat units insist that standards will not be lowered, but the comments by General Dempsey and arguing for 1 in 4 enlisted recruits in the Navy and Marine Corps to be women, as Navy Secretary Ray Mabus did last year, these have added to concerns that things other than mission effectiveness would be prioritized. Well, second, I think we have to have realism about sex differences. Men and women are different, and those differences are relevant to the military combat mission. Not just in regard to individual capacity, but also with respect to community. Those exceptional few women who do qualify for combat occupational specialties enter units whose culture will change as a result of their participation. That may yield some positive results, but it also exposes considerable risks. In particular, placing women in combat units ignores the realities of human nature that emerge when men and women are in close quarters in situations where privacy is not always feasible. Given the prevalent reality of attraction between the opposite sexes, society has taken great pains to protect the good of its full expression in marriage. Norms like modesty and privacy are reflected in public and professional settings by sex-segregated restrooms and locker rooms, for example. While in combat and special operations, however, this physical proximity, intensity, and lack of privacy often dismantle those very protections. That not only has the potential to create sexual tension for the men and women in those operations, it is also likely to add considerable stress to service members' marital relationships, which already suffer serious strain during deployment. This concern about family effects came up frequently in the 2015 survey of U.S. Special Operations Forces on integrating women in their ranks. And here are a few of the comments made by SEALs interviewed in that survey. Quote, "It's a major concern for a lot of the wives. It's bad enough that half of us have a better relationship with our platoon than our family." Another, "The wives will definitely object. My wife knows how close we are. She won't want a female entering that mix." Third, "I think my wife would probably have trouble with me shacking up in a tent with a woman for a week on a mountain. I've done dives in small confined spaces. It's not a job that men and women can do together." But it's not only the men who need to be concerned about the prospect of marital strain due to women joining their ranks. Military women have a much higher divorce rate than military men, and the rates are highest among female Marines. In 2010, the divorce rate among enlisted female Marines was 10.4%, 502 divorces out of 4,800 marriages. Divorce rates among military personnel trend up during times of deployment. In 2001, the military divorce rate was 2.6%. By 2011, it had reached 3.7%. Thankfully, it has steadily declined since then and reached 3.1% in 2014. The push for women to participate in combat blurs gender distinctions. Men and women are not interchangeable in every context, and it does not advance women to suggest otherwise. Celebrating our diversity means making distinctions between male and female, not simulating sameness. That matters both for women and men, and in both the military and in society at large, and I'll say more about that in a moment. The question, therefore, is not merely what can women do as autonomous individuals. It's not just about a female body's strengths or a woman's aptitudes. The real issue is how to use those given capacities in relation to others. So this is a new opportunity for us to ask some very basic questions. Will we acknowledge and accept the givenness of differences between men and women? Will we choose to express that givenness in ways that acknowledge and accept our relational context, rather than emphasizing our autonomy to the exclusion of that relational context? Third, protecting life. It's one thing for women to be incidentally drawn into combat or to be attached to a combat unit for a discrete functional mission. But to plan for women to participate in that frontline combat that's just been described puts their lives at disproportionate risk, and potentially the lives of their unborn children as well. Women's increased risk of injury makes them more vulnerable when engaging the enemy. Jude Eden, who served in the Marine Corps and opposes opening combat roles to women, says this: "Combat is not an equal opportunity for women because they don't have an equal opportunity to survive." Women on the front lines would be especially at risk if captured by the enemy, as evidenced by the gross violations of women's human rights over the last year by ISIS. Women's presence on the front lines also appears to be exposing them to greater risk of assault, as a study published in Women's Health Issues Journal in 2013 reported. That study said that servicewomen who had combat-like experiences during their deployment in Iraq and Afghanistan were, quote, much more likely to report sexual harassment and sexual assault compared with other deployed women. Pregnancy makes a woman more vulnerable in a combat situation and puts her unborn child at great risk. In a 2013 study, women in the military had unintended pregnancy rates about 50% higher than those of women in the population at large. Just war theory is particularly concerned with safeguarding non-combatants. The potential for combat experience to degrade women's unique capacity to carry human life is at odds with that consideration of justice for the unborn non-combatant. And finally, society at large. I began by comparing the idea of putting women into combat roles to dismantling a load-bearing wall, and that analogy has two implications. First, eliminating the barrier to combat roles will fundamentally change the military by introducing new variables that risk detracting from combat effectiveness. The second implication is that such a shift in the military will have much further reaching consequences for society as a whole. One aspect of this, at least, is very concrete. By making women eligible for all military occupations, including combat specialties, Secretary Ash Carter has removed the primary reason the Supreme Court cited for not requiring women to register for selective service. If the draft were reinstated in a future conflict and women were included, it would have vast consequences for individual women, for families, and for society at large. But even absent the draft question, sending women into combat changes society. It further discourages thinking about ourselves in relation to others. And once again, rather than celebrating the uniqueness of women, it pushes them to become more like men. It's rooted in the idea that's wrong, that equality means sameness. Wartime division of labor has historically charged able-bodied men with waging battle and tasked women with salvaging society through the ravages of war. This has underscored that continuing to cultivate the fruits of peace is as urgent a priority as waging war to protect it. Moreover, women's critical distance from combat has been an important part of keeping society's conscience, apart from the hardening we associate with the prospect and experience of combat. Now, few of us alive today have experienced an all-out conflict that called on men and women together to accomplish such a great civilizational endeavor. And perhaps because of that, it is difficult for us to fathom a social mission that requires us to act in solidarity with our own sex in a way that complements the role of the opposite sex. We've lost an understanding of how this complementarity infuses the uniqueness of males and females as well as our interconnectedness. Recovering that, rather than rejecting this reality of our nature, would help us all, women and men, be more fully human and more fully realize our potential. We would do well to recognize this load-bearing wall of our society and to stop dismantling it before a crisis shows us why we needed its support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our panelists have been erudite and brief, and that gives us approximately 35 minutes for questions and responses and answers. So please, the floor is yours.
My name is Dave Rogers. I'm on the board of trustees here. But to your point, I think there's another area that we didn't address today, and that is when one human being kills another human being. I think there's an after effect. The first time I killed someone in combat, I vomited, and with a couple of hours, I was shooting like crazy back. So, but we have people with PTSD, and I don't think we've discussed the impact on killing other people. If women are killing other people, what is that going to have? What's the impact going to be on them for having had to do that in combat?
There's a book came out about a decade and a half ago called On Killing. It was written by a Army Lieutenant Colonel, and he made many of the same points. That when you kill somebody, you are psychologically changed. Now, people react to that differently, just as they react to the stresses of combat differently. But the fact is that what you're talking about here is that it gets back to your. I like your that load-bearing wall, the coarsening of society. I mean, it's bad enough when a man kills someone, but the idea of women killing other people seems somehow unnatural. We know they do it. They've been doing it for a long time. But the fact is, there's something that seems to be the women, and again, this is such a traditional view of women as the protectors of life rather than the takers of life. One of the reasons I don't like to see women beating each other up in those UFC rings. There's something that just seems to be wrong with that. But I think that's a really good point. And by the way, that fits with the rest of the whole idea of not only the physical, but the psychological implications that are unintended in terms of the health care that's going to be necessary for female veterans, especially if they've been involved in the sort of close combat you're talking about.
It's a great question and a topic that the chaplains deal with quite a bit because women are more prevalent in combat in the past decade. This is a fairly new field. It's how to provide treatment for women who have been in combat and are experiencing post-traumatic stress. And so it's an issue the VA is dealing with because it's a serious issue among our veterans. Thank you for asking that.
Questions?
Hi, my name is Andrew Harris. I'm a student here at IWP. We hear a lot about, or I've heard a bit about the IDF, and it's been celebrated as being some sort of co-ed combat institution for a bit. But when I hear the debates on women in the U.S. infantry, I don't hear a lot of reference to how the Israelis have experienced that with the Caracol units. My understanding, the Caracol units aren't actually that good, and when the IDF needs something to get done, they turn to the traditional infantry because the Caracol units are riddled with problems. If you're familiar with MTV, my female Israeli friend told me it's sort of like the real world Negev. Has that been referenced that much in the literature you've seen?
Actually, I wrote a piece a really long time ago where I talked about the Israeli case. I was wanted to say that in the social sciences it's very hard to do an experiment for obvious reasons. But the closest we have to that is in fact the IDF. If you look at the situation before the War of Independence for Israel, women were integrated in many respects into Haganah and some of the other organizations, which were essentially guerrilla units, and most of what women did was to smuggle weapons and things like that, because the British were too gentlemanly to search them and things like that, so they were very effective at that. As soon as the war broke out, the first thing the Israelis did was pull all the women out of those units and segregate them. Now, over the years, it's gone back, it's moved back. You've got women flying fighter planes in the IDF Air Force. But I was on a panel about a year and a half ago with a female colonel from the IDF, who swore that women had been fully integrated into the IDF, into their M3 units. But when pressed, she made exactly that point. Well, not all of them. There's sort of the territorial, regional ones you're mentioning and so forth, which are fine for local defense, but certainly not the elite, not the special operations forces. All these sorts of things are still segregated the way that they once were. So, look, I mean, there's also a difference between Israel and the United States. In many respects, Israel is fighting for its life. It's that they have to worry about that. It's the same with the Kurdish women, things like that. So when people trot out, I think the IDF, Israel Defense Force, that argument, I think they're missing a very important aspect of that, and that is, for all the same reasons that we have in the past, they continue to segregate men and women when it comes to infantry war.
I recently had an hour and a half long Skype conversation with an IDF friend who's a commander in several infantry units. And he's not yet retired, so I can't publicly quote him. But he says the exact same thing. He says the Caracol units have had problems. They're light infantry, in some ways more like military police, border patrols, and they patrol the Egyptian border, so they see contact, and it can be very kinetic. And some of the female warriors in that unit have killed and have earned valor citations. But he pointed out a couple other things, that in terms of an integrated force, it's quite interesting because it's something like 60 to 70% women. So they've achieved a critical mass where they flip a lot of the cohesion problems that might be found where women are minorities in a group. But he also pointed out the same thing. They're not in armor, they're not in artillery, they're not in the tanks, they're not in heavy infantry, for all of the reasons that have been cited. He urged me, when Americans gestured to the IDF to prove that women in combat works, that I needed to remind them that they're speaking slang. That was his thing. The IDF actually doesn't do what so many other people in America say we do, for all the reasons that Jack has described. Just as a point of maybe idle trivia, the clerical units, do you know what they're named for? A cat, a desert cat whose external genitalia are apparently very difficult to discern. I thought that was a joke, but apparently it's accurate. You got it on your patch. So I don't know if that is valuable to know or not, but there it is.
I guess I would add that there were 33 studies that were done, both internally, in the United States military, other agencies, FBI, CIA, firefighters, police forces within the United States, and then also international studies of international militaries. And so most of the data, reflected what's been talked about. I guess I would say it's fairly new for women to have the opportunity to even think about this kind of service, or even in athletics. 1984 was the first time that women competed in the marathon. Prior to that, the longest race was 1,500 meters. And just in that 30-year span, the gap between marathon runners, men and women, has had tremendous gains. So I don't. I take some of this data is that women just haven't served in these roles and in the same way. So I don't see large numbers being part of the force anytime soon. One year I was jumping overseas with one of our allies in special operations, and I was surprised to see an all-women unit in special operations of our ally. And as I got to know the unit a little bit more, they had all these special skills in special operations, and their missions were pretty incredible on behalf of their country and ours as well, with equal interest. And so, and this was a decade ago. And so there's some things that are happening out there that aren't in the studies as well. Where women are doing some pretty amazing missions that we would think are traditionally male.
I would like to ask if there is any data available regarding the behavior of women once they are no longer in the army. I mean, there is a number of films and books written about the results of war on men and about the different conflicts that arise when they come back home and they are changed by combat. So it's hard for me to imagine what impact on a family could have a woman in this situation. Because definitely the role of a mother and the role of a father is different. So I am just wondering what kind of changes this would provoke in a family. A mother comes back from combat and she has been killing people and she had to be strong. She had to suppress her emotions. This might be very destructive for the family. Do we have any data that we could compare to this theory?
Great question.
Any kind of experience that we use as an example?
So I think what's been said here about the combat experience being so new that there still needs to be studies of the aftermath. But what the statistics that I began to talk about, the divorce statistics being, deployment is really hard on military families, and that's, I think, something we need to take into account when we're thinking about both men and women being in those situations. So that family factor, I would argue, really needs to be a part of this conversation as well.
Yeah, and I think, as was suggested, that since this is a relatively new phenomenon, we're going to see it downstream. We're probably not seeing it now, we're seeing bits and pieces of it. But as, if we go down this road all together, if there'll be lots of studies that will show the effects of it. I would make a prediction, I'm not going to say it right now, but you can kind of guess, but I think that, we will see sort of the unintended consequences of this decision to go beyond the battlefield, go home and become basically part of civilian society as well.
Hi, my name is Brandon Proctor. I'm an intern at the IRD. C.S. Lewis said that battles are ugly when women fight, but societies that send women off to war are even uglier. And Jennifer, you mentioned the implications that has on marriage and family. What other future implications do you see of integrating women into combat that could have on our society?
Well, even just reflecting for this talk has made me want to be more diligent in thinking through our self-concept in relation to one another. I think that's really important, and I think this is one of the most significant things that we need to be thinking about throughout policy is the relational nature of human beings, and therefore decisions are almost never in public policy about individuals as individuals. They always have a relational ripple effect. So I just think there are lots of implications of that will bear out in many different ways. And listing them is, I think it's a whole set of dynamics and cultural understanding that will blur our habit of thinking of ourselves in relationship to others, and rather thinking more of ourselves as in our autonomy.
Or if people introduce Steve Winters. Perhaps I address this to the chaplain. I did go to this meeting just a few years ago, this Women in International Security, and in particular all-day conference on women having combat roles that are all military roles open to women. And there was a lot of emotion. It was predominantly military women at this conference, but not sponsored by the military. And there was a lot of very strong emotion, which you could sense in the room. Basically, people feeling, women feeling, we've been denied our chance to, make the contribution we can make, or, even sort of what I thought were quite grosser emotions, like, oh, we're going to cut these men down to size and show them what we can do, and this idea that, they're looking down on us, we're going to show them. This was, explicitly expressed by several people at the meeting. But at the same time, they also reported, but one person reported, well, I got this letter from my father's best friend, and he said, look, I'm not talking to you anymore because, what you're doing is you're trying to get my daughter, drafted or whatever, conscripted, and then forced into combat. And this is something that you've all mentioned in the talk. It's this very strong feeling, and I want to ask the chaplain exactly how you're going to come down on this. So what it comes down to is this: the feeling is, okay, so there are some extraordinary women who probably, by all standards, without lowering any standards, could fit into any of these positions. But the problem is, what's that percentage? And then if we open the door there, as seems to be the government push or policy, then the feeling is, well, what about this large group of people, the daughters or whatever you want to think of, who might end up being forced into combat as so many millions of American males were forced into combat, people who never thought they would ever find themselves killing other human beings, all killed a lot of people, and so forth and so on, a totally unexpected experience. But just look at World War II as for the males. So how do you address that issue? Because that actually is a very strong feeling of whatever, maybe it's an old-fashioned feeling, but protect the daughter, protect whatever. How do you address the tension between that very strong feeling, but on the other hand, the strong feeling of certain extraordinary individuals? If those extraordinary individuals open the door, then the thought is, I'm sorry I'm dragging on here, that the non-extraordinary females are going to be shoved through the door at some future crisis in a way that they perhaps could do other things to contribute to the war effort and be more effective.
And would it be that there would be no need for men and women to be in combat? I would ask all those who pray that you would pray for peace, and that when you pray for peace, that we would all work together every day toward that end. Combat is the reality of our world, and so we send our troops every day into harm's way, and it is an awful thing for any human being to experience, no matter where they are on the battlefield. That's the reality. And I take a pretty broad perspective on national security. I said this yesterday at the Brookings. I believe all able-bodied men and women, citizens of this country, have a responsibility for our national security. And as a Christian clergy, I believe God calls each person with a divine purpose to fulfill on this earth. And sometimes it's very traditional, and I'm a fan of traditional roles, even though I'm in non-traditional roles. But I believe God has called me to that, and I will serve till the last day on this earth to fulfill that calling. So it doesn't fit for everyone. But in this country, men and women, boys and girls as they grow up, they can follow that call. And I believe that's with the registration selection for service. I believe that's the responsibility of every citizen. And I think our nation will approach national security differently when all adults who are able will have to register. The fear of what may be down the road, I think that's smart people need to consider that in our policy. But I think the greater good is that we all take responsibility for that. And when young men register, I see it. I've seen it. I've experienced it when young men that I know, when they register, it's like, yep, now this is my responsibility to my country. And when women do that, then we too will sign our name to the responsibility for our national security.
Look, there are plenty of things that women can do in the military, just not the infantry. Okay, the fact is that the infantry is really a very small part of the military these days. I mean, the fact is, and that's a good thing. You know, the improvement of accuracy, weapons, all these sorts of things. As people complain about the tail to tooth ratio, the fact that we have such a logistic tail, but that's a good thing. That enables us to project power across the world if we need to and sustain it for long periods of time. as we did in Vietnam. Okay, no other country in the world could have done what we did in Vietnam in terms of the sustained projection of power. So there are plenty of things I think that women can do for our national security. And I go back, I mean, even in terms of this broader issues, the Marine Corps has a program called the Lionesses. These are women who go out and who interacted, especially in Afghanistan, in a very traditional culture where they could relate to women in a way that would not be permitted within this traditional society if it involved male Marines or anything like that. So there are plenty of these things. And again, were these women basically subjected to danger? Certainly they were. But again, I go back to the unique mission of Special Operations Forces and the infantry. That's different. There's plenty of things, as I say. I go back, again, mentioning my students in the Naval War College. These women are they're smarter than men. Okay, everybody knows that women are smarter than men. Okay, and they've done all sorts of things in their time in the service, but they just haven't served in the infantry. That doesn't mean they weren't leaders. There are plenty of opportunities for leadership in the military that don't require you to lead an infantry battalion. So I agree with the chaplain, but I also recognize that a military like the United States has lots of opportunities, and again, I see real problems with women in the infantry as opposed to the military at large.
Mac, can I ask the question? We've identified areas where women might serve in frontline units, the Lionesses being a prime example. There's also the question about whether the opportunity for women to go to the Ranger School, for instance, is open. Is there a place for women to be trained up in those kinds of combat roles, but still not assigned directly to combat? So if Jessica Lynch had a Ranger tab on her shoulder, would she have been that much more effective in self-defense and the defense of her logistical unit? Was there a space for that? Yeah.
Look, I mean, if you can meet the standards, you can go. One of the problems is, again, many women have not been able to meet those standards. I mean, clearly the chaplain did, jumping out of that perfectly good airplane, standing off. I mean, that's part of the problem, and that leads to another problem. That is the idea that, well, one of the reasons that women fail in some of these areas is they don't have mentors. There's not enough critical mass. And I've heard it suggested that, well, if we want to have a woman in the SEALs, we need to have some women that are not necessarily SEAL qualified. We'll put them in the SEALs anyway so they can mentor these folks. I think that's disastrous. But yet, that's part of the dynamic that's going on here.
You had a comment to the comment?
No, actually, I have just a question related to the perception of the American Army. Because has anybody asked themselves the question how American Army is going to be perceived by other armies in combat if they involve women in combat? Because my logical assumption would be that then the enemy is going to focus on the weak spot, which is always going to be women, and then maybe their colleagues from the battalion, instead of attacking the enemy, they will be protecting women, because the aftermath of them being captured is going to be so horrible that they will just not be able to stand it. And instead of the offensive, they will always focus on the defensive. Of course, there's also the aspect of American Army being perceived as ridiculous by the nations that do not allow the women to serve and think it's downright stupid, so to say. Because why would you make yourself weak if you can be strong? So it's not only a matter of internal American ideology, it's also a matter of how the army is perceived, because you just may weaken yourself due to cultural differences. Has anybody asked that question?
Well, I mean, the dynamic you described was exactly at operating with the IDF. I mean, much of what was going on there was the fact that when we're fighting 5 Arab armies, what are these Arabs going to do if they capture one of our women? And what that led to, of course, at the end of it, the protective protecting this stepped in, and rather than doing your mission, you were focused on protecting women and so forth. And that's what led to this immense cultural shift from, a country that was based on an ideology that was very egalitarian, to the extent of not making distinctions between men and women in the secular Zionist state, due to the fact that the practicality showed them that this was in fact something that needed to be in. So there was a substantial shift as those women were pulled out of the idea of combat, anything related to combat and the idea.
It
We need
also-
to.
Oh,
I'm
sorry.
sorry, go
I
ahead.
was just going to say it also gives women in countries where we're serving some hope. A lot of places where we serve, women can't drive. They need to be fully covered if they go out in public. They can't go out in public without a male escort from their family, and so that gives.
No, but I'm concerned about this situation where a female American soldier is captured, repetitively raped, and this is like a common knowledge about the foreign army that you can do that. This is going to compromise the security of all the units. Because what they are doing to women, the ISIS soldiers, it's known. They sell women for sex slavery, even though it's not soldier women. So imagine what they are going to do to the enemy woman soldier. It's just, I bet that this could be much more horrible than to a man soldier. So why at all consider this? And then tackle the necessity of having those women hospitalized and possibly for life incapacitated psychologically. Why would you do that to yourself? I'm sorry, I'm not American, but I just don't understand.
Our troops are in harm's way every day, and we need to keep all of our troops in our prayers.
No, but why put women in harm's way? They're already
They're there now. Yes.
We need to, because our lunch program is starting in 5 minutes, we need to take at least a 5-minute break. So maybe the conversation can continue offline. So thank you panelists, for a wonderful presentation.
What's the logistics?
And lunch is waiting for you out there in the